Project Management for Healthcare Managers, Week 5, Project Planning, Budget or Cost Management, HTML 375. Cost management is about managing money during the project. There are three basic parts to cost management. The first two parts will be reviewed in this presentation, and the final part of cost management, earned value management, will be reviewed in the monitor and control section. The first part is estimating costs, being able to predict the cost of the project, and the second part is compiling the costs into a budget. The third part of cost management is controlling costs through earned value management. For many healthcare organizations, the money for a project is typically managed by a financial analyst or the accounting and purchasing department. In the PMBOK, there is an assumption that the project manager will be managing the project finances. It will be more likely that projects you will encounter in healthcare will require relying on a financial analyst to develop a budget, or the purchasing manager to pay project expenses. The role of the financial accounting is the allocation and use of budget for capital projects, and determine through financial analysis that the project has value and is worth its value to the organization through cost-benefit analysis or a review of the return on investment. There are factors to consider when creating a cost management plan. One factor is the unit of measurement. How will the money be assigned and monitored during a project? In the time and materials approach, the costs are defined in tracking material costs and the cost of labor and staffing. Time and material approach is based on hours worked, where fixed price is based on a single unit cost. What does the level of precision and accuracy have to be in the project? How on target do the estimates need to be, and how much variance is allowed in the estimation process? Control thresholds are established to determine limits to spending, to use the budget to plan and set thresholds for costs and a process to escalate if the costs rise above the threshold. Another factor is how performance will be measured and monitored. In this class, earned value management is a tool to measure project performance. A final factor is the reporting strategy and how status gets reported to leaders and the rest of the organization. The costs of the projects are either direct costs or indirect costs. Direct costs are the costs that are applied and used in the project. Resource costs in a project or direct costs are usually material costs, buying supplies, and materials that are required by the project. There are also labor costs, the price for staffing resources and professional services to complete a project. Indirect costs are the administrative costs of the business. Materials and service need to keep the doors open and the business functioning, but not directly attributable to the project. Office supplies and building rent are a good example of indirect costs. It depends on the organization whether indirect costs are applied to a project, but typically this isn't the case. In a few healthcare organizations, indirect costs are added as a percentage of the total direct costs for administrative expenses. However, most healthcare organizations account for indirect costs on a different budget. Cost estimates are determined by the prediction of the amount of materials needed and the staffing needed to make the project happen. It also identifies when the money has to be available. One of the other considerations there is whether it should be purchased from a vendor. This becomes part of procurements if the decision is to buy a service or product. Procurements is in a different section, but the initial decision starts as a part of the cost estimate process in cost management. The next step in cost management is estimating costs. There are different approaches to estimating costs. These look a little familiar because they're similar to estimating duration. Expert judgment is asking the team or subject matter experts how much they estimate the cost to be. Keep in mind that sometimes that subject matter experts add little to their estimate, and if everyone does that, the costs become inflated higher than expected. Analogous estimating is estimating based on something else. Parametric estimating is using a unit price and multiplying times the number of units. Bottom-up estimate is providing an estimate based on the estimates of each activity. This is usually more precise than top-down estimates, taking an estimate of the project as a whole. Top-down estimating is usually required when first requesting capital funding. Then budget estimates are adjusted with bottom-up estimating. Three-point estimating is also based on expert judgment, and it's a formula based on an optimistic estimate, the pessimistic estimate, and the average. Once each of the costs are identified, the next step is to determine the budget. The budget will give us a schedule on how much money will be spent during the execution of the project. One way of doing it is cost aggregation, when costs are accumulated over the course of the project. The costs for each week are identified and added together. These totals accumulate week by week until the end of the project, and the total accumulated costs equal the total budgeted cost of the project. Reserve analysis is taking the total project cost and adding on a contingency, an allocation of funds to account for things going wrong, and the cost to get back on track. In some healthcare organizations, the total estimated budget of costs is requested as a capital request. Revenues in a company are separate from operating costs, and the reserve request is identified as approved, but not added into the capital request. For example, if the total cost of the project was $10,000 and 10% was requested in reserve, the capital request would be for the $10,000 and the 10% would be approved and assigned as needed. The steps in developing a cost baseline is to estimate the cost needed using one of the estimating technique, and then the activity is assigned its associated costs. The activities come from the work breakdown structure, and we'll be using our schedule to distribute the cost across the activities. Then the costs are added for each week to get a weekly cost total. After estimating the costs, we estimate the timing to assign the funding. The funding is when money will need to be available to support the project. In many large healthcare projects, all the money is not available at the beginning, but is made available before the costs are used. The next step is to estimate the reserve funding, when to make the money available to account for risk and to get the project back on track. I've set a small example of the steps to demonstrate the activities that are in estimating cost baseline. I've estimated the following costs for a small backyard project. I've already broken down the work and put the work into a 7-day schedule, which will be on the next page. The first step is creating a cost baseline, and I've estimated the cost of the project using analogous estimates, using the cost from the last time I had to do a project like this. The cost to prepare the yard is $100. The cost to pour a patio is $600. A deck is estimated to cost $300, and the landscaping to complete the project is $150. The next step is to assign the costs to the activity. For my work breakdown, I developed the following schedule. It would take 2 days to prepare the yard, and for the next 3 days, I'm going to be building the deck and the patio at the same time. The last 2 days, I'll be planning around the deck and the patio. Next, I have assigned the estimates from the previous page to each item. The first activities will be estimated to be $100, and since it takes 2 days, each day will have a $50 cost associated with it. The next 3 days, the deck and the patio are being built. The patio is estimated to be $600, and the deck is estimated to be $300. Since both jobs occur over 3 days, the patio takes $200 a day, and the deck will be $100 a day, so each cost are estimated to be $300 a day. Spreading the cost like this is important to be able to track progress in earned value management. The final step takes 2 days, and the estimated costs are $150, and the daily costs are $75 per day. Identifying and assigning the costs to the activities and adding the cost daily, or in a larger project, adding the cost weekly, provide the cost baseline for the project. The next step is estimating funding. The type of funding model I'm following here is to get funds released in increments. If you've ever had a construction loan, the bank won't give the contractor all the money up front, but releases the money after each inspection. This reduces the risk for the bank in this case. I have 3 disbursement here. $100 needed prior to starting the first 2 days, $900 needed for day 3 through 5, and $150 needed for the last 2 days. The funding increments would be milestones in the project plan, which is typically preceded by an approval. Some projects in healthcare have this model. However, most of the budget and funding is handled by finance or the accounting department, and the funds are available when they're needed and managed by this department. To estimate the reserve takes a prediction of the amount of risk you're willing to pay to keep things on track. In the risk section, you will learn how contingency works and having a plan in case things go wrong. But in this case, we'll just have a reserve be a percentage of the total cost. A standard reserve is 10%. In the example, my total costs are $1,150, and 10% of this would be $115. My total estimate for the project with reserve is $1,265. A good way of putting this is that I plan to spend $1,150 on this project, but I want $1,265 in the bank to account for variance or if things aren't going as planned. Funding in healthcare typically starts out as an initial capital request and the budget is created and a bottom-up estimate is submitted. For the revenues that are received by the hospital or clinic will be primarily distributed as operating costs or capital purchases. The operating costs cover the daily operations or equipment, staff, supplies, services to make a department run. And capital is the revenues used for major purchases, building or growth. The capital will cover major projects for the year. Any overages not accounted for in a reserve will come out of the operating budget. A pro forma is a form or document requesting funds from an organization, which includes how the funds will be used. This is an example of a pro forma document that may be submitted to leadership and finances to request funds for a project. The finance department will use a pro forma to create an organizational finance plan and verify through analysis that the funds will be available when requested. In review, we looked at the impacts of cost management, what the costs of projects include. Then we talked about planning, what makes up the parts and steps that go into creating a cost baseline, and what are the methods of estimating costs. There was an example of each step to determine a budget, and we wrapped up how healthcare projects are funded.